All right, folks, buckle up for a deep dive into something super relevant if you're thinking about those UPSC exams. We're talking about India's population.
Mhm.
But hold on, there's a twist.
Yeah, forget those headlines about India's booming population because, get this, India's birth rate is actually falling.
Falling fast.
That's right. And it's something we're seeing in other developed countries, but what's really fascinating about India is that it's happening even before they've reached that same level of economic development. We're basing this deep dive on a recent article from The Hindu.
The Hindu. Okay.
It takes a look at the latest findings from something called the Global Burden of Diseases Study. Really interesting stuff.
So this study,
Yeah.
it's saying that India's total fertility rate, TFR for short,
Right.
has dropped, like dramatically.
Yeah, dramatically is a good word for it. It's basically, just a way of saying how many children a woman has on average over her lifetime.
I see.
And think about it. Back in the 1950s, that number was 6.18.
Wow.
Now, in 2021, it is down to 1.9. Huge difference.
1.9. Wow, that's a huge drop.
Yeah, and that 1.9 is super important because it's actually below what we call the replacement level. That's 2.1.
Okay.
And that's the magic number that you need to keep a population stable, right? So if you're below that, it means you're not having enough babies to essentially replace the existing population.
Yeah, that's a pretty big deal, especially for a country as large and as populated as India. But it's interesting, though, because this trend isn't uniform across the country. We're seeing different things happening in the north compared to the south.
You're absolutely right. The north and south of India are telling completely different stories, demographically speaking.
Right. So states in the south, places like Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, they actually hit that replacement level fertility much earlier. And when you look at those states, they also seem to be kind of ahead of the curve in other areas too, right?
Yeah.
We're talking higher literacy rates, more women working, better access to healthcare.
Exactly. And all of those things seem to be connected to those lower birth rates.
So it seems like access to family planning could play a role.
For sure. For sure. I mean, it's not quite as simple as saying, oh, well, if you have access to family planning, your birth rate will automatically go down.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
way more nuanced than that. It's really a whole mix of things, social factors, economic changes, cultural shifts. All of them play a role in this whole fertility puzzle.
I see.
It's complex, yeah.
So let's talk about Kerala for a minute,
Mm-hmm.
because their projections actually show that their elderly population is going to outnumber children by, get this, 2036.
Yeah, that's right around the corner, really. It's a huge, huge demographic shift. And of course, it comes with a whole host of challenges. Thinking about it, I mean, you're going to see a much greater need for elder care, and you're going to have a shrinking workforce.
Yeah.
Social services are going to be stretched thin. These are all things that policymakers are going to have to really grapple with in Kerala. Some tough questions.
It does sound a bit like a looming crisis.
Yeah.
But is there maybe a silver lining there? Because Kerala is known for its high quality of life, right?
Mhm.
So maybe that could work in their favor somehow.
That's actually a really good point. And, some experts believe that Kerala's unique situation could work to its advantage in this case. Because they have higher wages and a better standard of living compared to many other parts of India, they might actually see an influx of migrant workers coming in from other states.
Right, so those migrants could help to fill those gaps in the workforce.
Mhm.
The ones that are going to be created by this shrinking population.
Exactly. And it's a really fascinating example of how, migration patterns can play such a big role in all of this. It could even help to offset some of the challenges of these demographic shifts.
Okay, so we've talked about the fact that the fertility rate's declining,
Uh-huh.
and we talked about how it's different in the north and south, and we've even touched on some of the potential consequences. But the big question is, why is this happening across India? What's driving this trend?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's a really complex one to answer.
Right.
But there are a few key things that seem to be at play here. And one of the biggest ones is just the massive socioeconomic changes that we're seeing in India.
Okay.
More and more women are getting educated, they're joining the workforce, and that's leading to, changing attitudes about marriage and family size.
So are people choosing to have smaller families or maybe even putting off parenthood altogether?
Both. Both are happening, absolutely. But it's not just that, right?
Yeah.
We've also got to consider the health and migration factors. We're seeing rising infertility rates, and there's greater acceptance of things like family planning and abortion.
I see.
And then you've got more and more young people who are migrating abroad, sometimes permanently. All of these things are feeding into this larger picture of a declining birth rate.
Wow. It sounds like it's like a puzzle with all these different pieces. And figuring out how they all fit together is going to be key to understanding what lies ahead for India, right?
You got it. It's not just about the numbers themselves.
Right.
It's about understanding how all of these forces are interacting. It's a complex picture, for sure.
So we've got this whole puzzle, right?
Hmm.
With falling fertility rates and all these different factors at play. What does it actually mean for India, for its future, especially when we're thinking about the economy?
Yeah, it's a huge question. And, like you said earlier, it's not a crisis right now,
Right.
but it's definitely something that India needs to plan for and maybe look at what some other countries are doing, to kind of encourage people to have more kids, thinking about family-friendly
Right.
policies.
Like what Germany's doing with
Yeah.
their generous parental leave policies and those flexible work arrangements.
Exactly. Exactly. If you can make it easier for parents to balance, work and family life, well, that could make a big difference.
Yeah, it makes sense. Starting a family might feel a little less overwhelming if, you have that support
Yeah.
and that flexibility. But then there's the whole cost of raising children. That's a big one these days. Feels like everything's getting more and more expensive.
Oh, tell me about it. And, that's a huge factor for young couples, especially. I mean, the cost of education, healthcare, childcare, it's a lot to think about, especially for those middle-class families that are already feeling kind of squeezed.
Right. So it sounds like if India wants to address this, they need to think about affordability, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, making education more affordable, better public health care, affordable child care. Would those kinds of things make a difference?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's really about creating an environment where families can actually thrive, both financially and socially. It all ties together. And thinking about challenges, India could maybe take a page from Denmark's book.
Right, with their state-funded IVF treatments. For women under 40, it's really interesting to see how different countries are trying different things,
Yeah.
Some are offering cash incentives, others are really focused on building these strong social support systems.
Yeah. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
Every country's got to find its own path,
Yeah.
right? And that means considering their cultural context, their economic realities. It's tricky.
Yeah, it's a complicated stuff. So we've talked about these family-friendly policies. We've talked about the cost of raising kids and even infertility. But what else should India be focusing on, in light of all of this?
Well, one thing that's super important is investing in human capital. If you've got a workforce that's potentially shrinking, well, you want to make sure that the people you do have are really skilled and productive.
It's like if you have fewer players on your team, you want to make sure they're the best, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So things like education, skills training, especially in those areas where there's going to be a lot of demand in the future, like STEM fields.
Yeah.
Technology, all of that's super important.
Right, so that India can stay competitive, even with this whole demographic shift happening. But what about the aging population? That's got to be a big concern too.
Oh, absolutely. And that means making sure that older people have access to good health care, affordable housing, and a strong support system. Because as that proportion of elderly people grows, the demand for those services is just going to keep going up, up, up.
Yeah, and India needs to be ready for it.
For sure. I mean, it's like we're preparing for a future that looks completely different from anything we've seen in the past, right?
Okay.
This demographic transition, it's full of challenges, but there are also a lot of opportunities.
Okay, so it's not just about avoiding the bad stuff. It's also about figuring out how to take advantage of this new reality. This feels like really crucial stuff for UPSC aspirants, right? Because understanding these trends and what they could mean for India's future is a big part of being able to analyze policies and coming up with solutions.
Totally. It's not just about memorizing a bunch of statistics for an exam, right?
Right.
It's about understanding the bigger picture, thinking critically, being able to articulate your ideas in a clear and persuasive way.
So for our listeners who are prepping for those UPSC exams, what kind of questions might they see related to this?
Oh, good question. Well, they might be asked to analyze how these declining fertility rates could impact India's economic growth.
Oh, okay.
Or maybe they have to evaluate different government policies that are designed to address this shift.
Yeah.
Or maybe even compare and contrast India's situation with other countries that are dealing with similar challenges. To really show that they They've got a deep understanding of all of this.
Yeah, it sounds like they really want to see that you can think for yourself and not just, regurgitate facts.
Right. It's all about applying your knowledge,
Yeah.
right,
All right.
to real world situations.
So for our listeners who are really diving deep into this topic, don't get too caught up in the numbers themselves.
Right.
Think about the so what. What does all this mean?
Exactly. What are the implications?
Yeah. What are the potential challenges, the
Yeah.
opportunities? Because even though India's fertility rate is going down, it still has a relatively young population.
That's right. Compared to a lot of other developed countries. So it's really about making the most of that.
Right. Investing in those young people
Yeah.
and their education,
Mm.
their skills, creating an environment where they can really thrive.
And that's where policy decisions become so crucial. Right.
Think about the role of government in all of this. What kind of policies can they implement to help families, to encourage investment, to foster innovation?
That's what they're looking for in those UPSC exams, right? That kind of deep thinking, that ability to connect the dots, to make a strong argument.
Absolutely, but we shouldn't forget about those regional differences.
Right, like the north-south divide we talked about earlier.
Exactly,
Yeah.
because while the South has seen this big drop in fertility rates, the North is still lagging behind.
Right.
So that means we need targeted interventions.
Right.
Right.
Okay. So things like promoting education for women in the North, improving access to healthcare, making sure that family planning services are available, and addressing those cultural and social barriers that might be keeping those fertility rates higher.
It's all about making sure that everyone in India benefits from this transition, not just certain regions. Right. That's a really good point. But then there's also migration patterns to consider.
Right.
Like we saw with Kerala.
Oh, yeah. Migration can be a real game changer when it comes to this stuff.
Right. Because it can help offset some of those challenges
Yep.
of an aging population.
Yeah.
But it also brings up all sorts of other questions.
Yeah.
About development and making sure that migrant workers have access to basic rights and services.
For sure. Managing migration flows, making sure those workers are taken care of, integrating them into the local economy, all really important stuff. It's not just one issue in isolation, right?
Right.
It's all connected.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot for policymakers to juggle.
Oh, it is. It's super complex. You can't just focus on one thing.
Right.
It's all interconnected. You got to think about those ripple effects.
So it makes policymaking really, really fascinating.
Oh, yeah. It's like a giant puzzle.
Right, because you have to think about all these different pieces.
Right, and how they fit together. And you got to be adaptable because things are always changing.
Right. So for those UPSC aspirants, that's the big takeaway.
Yeah. Understanding these demographic trends,
Mm-hmm.
analyzing what they could mean, thinking critically about solutions, that's what it takes
To be a good policymaker.
to tackle any policy challenge, really, not just those that are about population.
It sounds like this is pretty important stuff.
Yeah,
For
definitely.
anyone who wants to have a hand in shaping India's future, especially for our listeners who are gearing up for those UPSC exams.
Absolutely. This isn't just about, memorizing facts and figures. It's about being able to actually analyze them,
Right.
connect them to other issues, think critically about what it all means.
So how can our listeners, really connect all this back to their UPSC prep? Like, how's this going to show up on the exam?
Okay, so let's think about some potential exam questions here. They might ask you to analyze, how these declining fertility rates could impact India's economic growth, or maybe they'll ask you to evaluate, how effective different government policies have been at addressing this demographic shift.
Okay.
Or maybe even compare and contrast India's situation with other countries that are going through something similar
I see.
to really show that you get it. You've got a good grasp of the complexities here.
It sounds like they really want you to think for yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Not
Yeah.
just parrot back information.
Right. Show that you can actually apply what you've learned.
Right, to real world situations.
Okay, so for anyone who's listening and really studying this topic, what's your advice?
Don't get too bogged down in just memorizing the numbers.
Right.
Think about the so what.
The so what?
Yeah, like what are the implications of all of this? What are the challenges, the opportunities? Because, even though India's fertility rate is going down, it still has a pretty young population overall.
Right. compared to a lot of other countries that are more developed.
Exactly. So it's really about figuring out how to harness that.
Yeah. Investing
Yeah.
in those young people,
Yeah.
in their education,
Yeah.
making sure they have the skills they need, giving them an environment where they can really thrive.
And that's where those policy decisions are so important.
Right, right. Thinking about what the government can do to support families,
Mm.
to encourage investment, to promote innovation.
That's the kind of analysis that UPSC examiners are going to be looking for. They want to see that you can think deeply, that you
Right.
can make connections, that you can put together a really well-reasoned argument.
So for our aspiring IAS officers out there, this isn't just about checking boxes. It's about really understanding this demographic puzzle that India is facing
Yeah.
and thinking critically about how to solve it.
It's about the future of India.
And don't forget to check out that original article in the Hindu.
Yeah, good point. Lots of great information in there.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into India's declining fertility rates. We hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little thought-provoking and hopefully helpful for your UPSC preparation. If you enjoyed this episode, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your fellow aspirants. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a fascinating topic. Until then, keep learning, keep exploring, and best of luck with your exams.